So, John, I got a question for you.
All right.
What do you think of the current real estate buying process?
It's broken. So if you think about all of the stuff that's gone on, you know, realtors are not getting paid less than they were before the NAR decision. They're getting paid the same, if not more, than before the NAR decision. All you now know is that, hey, you as the buyer are paying for everybody. But you as the buyer now are doing way, way, way more work than you've ever done before. So you pick your favorite realty site, be it as it may, and you go, you look at the pictures. Hopefully they're real pictures, not AI generated pictures, what it could be versus what it really is. And you whittle down based upon literally your own knowledge of places that you should take a look at, places, that you think might fit your budget or whatever other constraints you have. And then you may go to an open house if you can find one and walk through it on your own. But for the most part, it's at that point that you probably engage a realtor and have that person take you through the properties and negotiate the price, hopefully find an inspection, but you should find the inspector on your own, just a piece of advice. And so you're still doing a ton of the work. It's almost self-service at that point. So I think, you're doing more and getting way less value than you used to. Where, if you think about it, you'd go to a place, you wouldn't know anything. You'd find a realtor, and the realtor knew the neighborhoods or knew the area, and they would actually help, guide you through the process, start to finish. Now, with all the realty sites, half of what they used to do, or maybe more, is taken out of the equation because you've already done that work. That's my thoughts. You?
I think that buyers are more exposed in the real estate process than they've ever been. The way it used to work is, the selling agent would pay for both realtors, and now the buyer potentially has to pay for that realtor with no guarantee of success. It can become a very weird situation, especially when the buyer's doing a lot more work. You go to your favorite site, you pick out the house that you want to see, you go, this is the house I want to see, and you're effectively paying a toll for an open house. If you're not represented, you got to sign a buyer's representation thing, and you're stuck with that buyer's agent for 60 or 90 days. It's like you're more exposed than ever. And I think now with the real estate sites pulling back from showing dangerous information about a house because it affects the selling price, even more buyers are exposed. And it drives me nuts. Because it's like, it shouldn't be this way. Just because life isn't fair doesn't mean you shouldn't try to make it that way. And it's unfair what's happening with buyers right now, to me.
Well, if you think about it, at our old company, which focused on perils, we would have people call us up, people that we knew, even people we didn't know, call us up and say, hey, what do you guys think about this house? And I remember the first one, a friend of yours, and she was moving to Houston, and we gave her the appropriate ration of crap for moving to Houston, even telling her that divorce was a solid option because her husband was being transferred there. We said that's no excuse. But we told her, we said, hey, your house is subject to all of the standard things in Houston: hurricanes, tornadoes, hail, lightning. But here's a piece of information that nobody's going to tell you, but you're in a 500-year flood zone. And the bank doesn't care because it's not a 100-year flood zone. The realtor probably doesn't even know where the flood zones are. And if they did, may or may not be able to tell you based upon local realty rules. And we said, we're going to give you some dad advice. go get flood insurance. It'll be cheap because you're not in a 100-year flood zone, and we hope you never have to use it." And what happens 6 months later? She texted you the photo of the water halfway up her front door and made the statement that they were so glad that they listened to us because they were the only ones in their neighborhood with flood insurance. And then my daughter comes into my office shortly after that and says, "I'm going to go buy a house." And as I told her, I said, "We will miss you." And she went out with a realtor that she found the usual way that people find realtors, either from a recommendation or, in her case, this person was in our ballroom dance class. And they went out on a Saturday. They looked at 9 houses. She comes back. "Hey, which one did you like?" Gave me the address. I plugged it into our system and I was like, "Nope, it's an F for wildfire. You already live in an F for wildfire. We don't need another F for wildfire." So they go out the next weekend. They look at another 9 houses. It's a lot of time. Think about this, at least a half an hour each one. And comes back and I said, "Which one did you like?" She gives me the address. And I said, "Were there bars on the windows?" And she's like, "No, why?" And I said, "Because it's an F for crime." And I said, "I get it. You're a second degree black belt. I'm not concerned, but no." They go out the next weekend, another 9 houses. Comes back, same routine. "Which one did you like?" Gives me the address. And I said, "Is there a large park nearby?" And she's like, "Yeah, there's a huge park right across the street. How did you know that?" I said, "Well, the house is 250 feet from an EPA Superfund site. And the largest one in Escondido is a park because it's so big they can't mitigate it." And I said, "You may grant us grandchildren someday. And if they have 2 heads, I will love them both. But I prefer just one." And, so we had it out with the realtor, adult battleship on the kitchen table. She's pulling MLS listings. I'm running the report and finding out everything that's bad with them all. And, we went through that process. Well, that process was barely covered by what was on the realty sites and now is not covered at all, but is covered in every report that we generate through PropertyLens because people need to know. And nobody's going to tell you.
I went to visit a property in South Dakota because I happen to be in South Dakota and I love touring properties. And it was a first floor level condo. And I look over to the river and I'm like, is this a flood zone? And the realtor's answer was, I'm not sure, which of course is what realtors say because they don't know. So I went to Property Lens and I looked it up. Sure as shooting, 500-year flood zone. Like, not in the flood zone, but right next to it. I'm like, nope.
Nope.
Eliminated it right away. It's like, no, I'm not going to do it. And some people can tolerate that risk. Me, I don't want to tolerate that risk. I get enough of that risk in my life. And it was 1 minute it took me to say no because I had the data in my hand. I had the advantage in my hand. Whereas if I didn't, and I rely on the realtor who doesn't know, they say, I don't think so. And then you got to go look it up and you got to do all this stuff. And it's not a required disclosure. It's like Property Lens simplified my life. That's why we built this company, is to simplify your life and improve your decision making by putting all this data in one place so you can see for yourself. I don't want to take that risk. Maybe some other people do. But I want the data to help me make that decision before we get married to this house. And it kills me how, buyers are just left to figure this out on their own.
You look at the information that's out there, and can you get all this stuff? Maybe. If you know where to look and you know how to get it and you know where else to go, and you're going to spend a ton of time pulling this information. And quite honestly, this is a Carfax for houses. And you need to be able to plug in an address, get the report, Takes a little bit longer than a Carfax to come back because we're doing an awful lot of work on our side, but not too much longer. And you're also making a much more expensive purchase. You know, the average car in the US might be $30,000, $40,000. The average house, easily three to $400,000. And until PropertyLens, there was no way to easily get all of this information. And it's why when you look at who currently buys a PropertyLens report, a lot of them are investors, property investors, the pros. You're using the same tool that the pros use when you're pulling a PropertyLens report for the properties that you're interested in. Make a better decision.
I kind of get a little itchy when people describe us as a Carfax for houses. And I love Carfax. I've used it a bunch of times whenever I buy a used car. But Carfax doesn't tell you like how many miles to go until you have to replace the tires. It doesn't tell you, what the expected life of the engine is. It doesn't give you anything to say what's the future going to look like. And it does a really great job of telling you the past, but tells you nothing about the future. And Property Lens is different. We not only tell you the past, we give you an idea of what the future is going to look like in that house at the same time. And that's something that, I'm flattered when people say it's like a Carfax for houses. It's simple to understand, but that's only half the story. The other half of the story is what's going to happen. What do we think is going to happen in this property? And that's, I think, the big difference between what we're doing here and a Carfax type report. And again, it's an awesome report, but we're not going to just tell you what we've seen. We'll tell you what we've seen and what we think is going to happen.
Well, houses don't typically run into other houses. So it's a little bit
That's
easier
a
for
bad
us
day.
to
It's a
predict
bad
the
day.
future because we know what the events are going to likely be. We know the age of the systems. We know whether or not there are permits. We know, what things may have been updated by the seller that didn't require permits. So we have an advantage in looking at the property that, our friends at Carfax don't happen to have when looking at a vehicle. But this is, for most people, the most expensive investment that they'll ever make.
The number one thing that we're trying to give home buyers is peace of mind that when you walk in the door, you know what to look for. You know what to expect. Maybe you choose not even to walk in the door because of what we show you, but maybe you do. And you get the peace of mind of knowing that somebody who doesn't really care whether you buy the house or not has put all of their effort into providing you with as much detail as possible about that property. And that to me is really the sort of the unsung part of what we're trying to do is it's like, listen, you might buy a house anyway. I bought this house. This house had a lot of problems. I bought it anyway. But I knew at least going in what those problems were so I could help manage them. It shocks me that people go in so unprepared to buying a house and then end up with all these surprise expenses, many of which we could have shown you before you walked in the door.
It's interesting that you went with peace of mind because I was thinking leverage. We give you leverage. The buyer is, in most cases, the least knowledgeable person in the transaction, and yet they're bringing all the money to the table. We're trying to level the playing field here and give you the knowledge as a buyer so you can negotiate effectively on the points that are really important. So if you know that the roof is old, that's a huge negotiating point. If you know that the systems are going to need to be replaced soon, huge negotiating point. And so I think, not necessarily peace of mind, though the more you know, the more you know. I think it's leverage would be my call as to what we provide. You are no longer completely at the mercy of the seller telling you the pieces and bits of information.
In a highly competitive market where there might be multiple offers on a house, you have less leverage. I think that in those markets, it's even more important to have information to tell you what might be hiding in the house, because you're not going to be able to get out around that with an inspection contingency in a highly competitive market. So knowing going in what you're going to have to handle is really, really helpful. It's a combination, in some markets it's leverage, in some markets it's peace of mind, and in some markets it's just, hey, these are questions I can ask so I can know how to manage this property going forward. And that's kind of cool. So, one of the comments we get all the time is, well, you should have a house inspector for that. I was like, of course you should have an inspection for a house. It's silly not to. But there's two situations why that's not the default. The first is that if you're in a competitive situation and you're not going to be able to get an inspection contingency, the inspector can point things out, but you're not necessarily going to be able to recover any costs from that. And the second is that the inspector doesn't discover everything. They don't look at the roof. They don't look at the sewer system. They only see what's visible, and all really important things, but not necessarily everything that you want to know going in.